May 6, 2019.
Now, it must be made known. These are not the words of a conspiracist, but an empiricist.
These are not the words of a poet, but a scientist.
These are not the words of one scientist or one government, but of 150 scientists from 50 governments,
who for 3 years systematically analysed 15,000 scientific sources and summarised direct threat.
And the casualty is 1 million endangered species and us.
The scientists say
nature is declining globally at rates unprecedented in human history, and the rate of species extinctions is accelerating, with grave impacts on people around the world now likely. We are eroding the very foundations of our economies, livelihoods, food security, health and quality of life worldwide. The essential, interconnected web of life on Earth is getting smaller and increasingly frayed. This loss is a direct result of human activity and constitutes a direct threat to human well-being in all regions of the world.
Direct threat.
And the casualty is us.
We are also the perpetrator.
Perpetrator and victims.
It is an uneasy paradox.
Suicidal.
Self-sabotaging.
Self-harming in more ways than a poet can name.
1 week later, May 14th, 2019.
Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere reached an all-time high, 415 parts per million.
Highest in recorded history.
415 is the most dangerous number.
Humans have never tried to survive, never hoped for life to thrive in these carbon-heavy conditions.
Before the Industrial Revolution, 280 parts per million.
That's a 130 parts per million rise.
We need a new kind of revolution that will keep us alive.
It will be bound,
gagged,
lobbied, locked,
controlled and blocked by business as usual.
$200 million spent every year by 5 oil and gas companies alone.
To seduce us with same. But don't worry, be happy.
But same is game, over and out.
Self-interest.
Self-centered.
Status quo.
Our dying words, our extinction words.
The end of an era.
even individuals is an outdated illusion.
If we are to survive, we must learn to think like a planet.
30 years, they give us.
2 to 3 decades to completely eliminate carbon emissions planet-wide.
12 years to cut them in half.
We've entered the red zone. It's a stop sign. It's a red light district.
1 million species are ringing the alarm bells with their own endangered bodies.
Not quick fix, fast book, tempting fate. No, not that mistake.
It is no longer climate change, but climate crisis.
We are at war with warming. We are at war with ourselves.
We invest in trying so hard to treat all of our addictions.
Alcohol.
Smoking.
Shopping.
Meth.
But no addiction is more deadly, widespread, and global than creating carbon.
We must learn to think like a planet, or it is the end of everything as we know it.
Decisions made in 2075 won't matter.
These are the scary words from the cheap seats that no one wants to hear.
Coming from the mouths of striking school children.
Intergovernmental scientists and the words of poets.
And we are not singing freedom songs. These are not songs of freedom. These are hard to hear songs of hard to face choices, of hard to make change.
What if we do not change? And I say this in the Pacific,
Asia,
Africa,
Europe,
Caribbean.
There will be no redemption song.
We will not be the first extinction, and we will not be the last. But we will be the only ones who did it to ourselves.
What a wonderful poem. by Carlo Mima, and a great way to start this session with a message of urgency, but also hope and our collective power to be the change that is needed. Welcome, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and wherever you are in the world. And I can see people have joined us from Nigeria, Pakistan, Trinidad, Mauritius, Kenya, Sri Lanka, and so many other places. Whether you're joining us via Zoom or on Facebook for this critical conversation hosted by the Commonwealth Institute on climate justice, small island states, and the COP26 Climate Summit. Before we start, let's quickly run through some house rules. We welcome your questions, and we will be using the Q&A function on Zoom and the comments section on Facebook. So if you're comfortable doing so, please do also put your name and country along with your question. And we're going to try to get to as many of your questions as possible. I know many of you already started using the chat function to introduce yourself to each other, but please do that. It's always lovely to know who we are, especially at this moment when so many of us face barriers to connecting because of the COVID pandemic. My name is Asad Rahman. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Anti-Poverty, Human Rights and Climate Justice Organization, War on Want. We work on the root causes of injustice, working with frontline communities all around the world, amplifying their voices, demands, and building the collective solidarity needed between peoples in the global north and south. Together with our partners, we've launched a call for a global Green New Deal to tackle the multiple crises of climate, economic inequality, the COVID pandemic, and the historical injustices that are hardwired into our economic and political systems that have created a world where, despite its abundance, so many are still denied the right to live with dignity. We're also a founder of the COP26 Climate Coalition that brings together NGOs, trade unions, faith groups, and citizens to centre climate justice in our demands ahead of the critical COP26 Climate Summit. Last month, climate scientists issued their latest code red warning for humanity that the devastating climate impacts that we're witnessing all around the world, fires, floods, famines, are already spiraling out of control. Whilst no increase in temperature level is safe, the reality is it's deadly for many. And it is the actions taken in this decade that will determine if we prevent a breach of the critical 1.5 degree guardrail when we begin to cross the point of no return and threaten the very existence of so many small island states, nations, our ecosystems, and our planet as well. The climate crisis, of course, is just compounding a number of other existing crises, from COVID to economic inequality, from the debt crisis to the global economic crisis, hardwood gains on gender and racial equality, decades of development gains are all being wiped out. The very lives and livelihoods of so many citizens in the global south now hang in the balance. With less than 50 days to go, world leaders will be gathering in Glasgow for the crucial COP26 Climate Summit. It's a summit, of course, that will take place amidst the inequities of COVID vaccines, and with many in the global south still asking themselves if they're even able to attend. It's a critical summit where the decisions made will show if we're finally taking the actions needed to address the planetary emergency. Will the richest and most polluting countries cut their emissions? Will the promises on climate finances be finally met? Will we see progress on adaptation and loss and damage? Or will this be yet another summit, strong on promises, but with little concrete action? I'm delighted to be joined by a very distinguished panel who have been some of the most powerful voices for climate justice. And I invite all of our panel to turn on the videos if you haven't done so far. Brilliant, thank you. We're joined today by Angelique Pouponu, who's a Seychelles lawyer and environmentalist. She's a CEO of Seychelles Conservation and Climate Adaptation Trust and is a co-founder of the SIDS Youth Aims Hub at Seychelles, and she has spearheaded young people in the region to mobilize, educate, and act in support of small island states. We're also joined by Ambassador Dessima Williams, who really needs very, very little introduction. She's a Grenadian diplomat and former ambassador to the UN from Grenada. She was the chair of AOSIS. She's been a long-time climate diplomat. Ambassador Williams has also been an activist and is a leading champion of intersectionality, connecting gender inequality and climate injustice. I'm really honored to also have Honorary Ralph Regan, I'm sorry, I'll pronounce that again, apologies, Ralph. Regan Vanu, who's the leader of the opposition in the 12th Legislature of the Parliament in the Republic of Vanuatu. Ralph is a former foreign minister and has led the fight to connect fossil fuels to the cost of the climate crisis, and has been one of the most powerful champions of the issue around loss and damage. Last but not least is my dear friend Richard Cosell-Wright, Director of the UN agency UNCTAD's Globalization and Development Strategies Division. Richard has helped author UNCTAD's Global Green New Deal to address the climate crisis, hyperglobalization, and has been a champion of proposing a vision of South-South cooperation to support SIDS to meet these multiple crises. So I'm going to turn to our panel. First of all, we know the small island states span the Caribbean to the Pacific and every point in between. Many face challenges of extreme poverty, other sea level rises, some are facing extreme weather impacts that have wiped out decades of development gains. Ambassador Williams, could you briefly maybe share a snapshot of some of the challenges being faced by small island states in the Caribbean and what you think is needed to address those challenges?
Thank you. Greetings, everyone. Good morning, good night, good afternoon. It's a real privilege to be here to participate in this Commonwealth Foundation event on the eve of COP26. And so I want to wish everyone, safety from COVID, ambition for the COP, and a great future because of the resolve we would bring to our work. Well, let me first say that COP26 offers us an opportunity to bring about a bending of the arch of climate justice towards those who need it most, towards islands and others. The islands are full of youth, the islands are full of women who, because of our social and economic situation, face a lot of inequalities, and therefore the impacts of climate events on women are differentiated and probably worse off most of the time than for men. And all our populations in the islands are under the threat of this climate emergency. I need not give you the examples of Vanuatu, of Fiji, of Haiti, of Grenada, my own country, and so on. But I think before we talk about contemporary challenges, we really need to look at the injustice of the history of climate change, where we are today. Those of us who have contributed least are most impacted. And we have the scant resources to respond to those impacts. So I think we have to keep that in our forefront. That's one of our biggest challenges, to have an appreciation on the part of the world that the injustice of climate change is continuing with the reluctance in some quarters to take the appropriate measures. And that's part of our biggest challenge. So as we go into COP26, we have a number of requirements or requests or negotiating positions. And I should quickly say that we need a great decision text. We need the rule book flushed out some more. We need real attention to climate finance. We need an emphasis on implementation and not just on more text, but really a focus on implementation. We need a COP that is inclusive. We need a COP that really brings us closer to the halfway cut for 2030. So I think that there's a lot of work to be done. The SIDS are on the front lines. We have always done our homework. We will not be caught off guard. And I think this panel and the young people that we saw suggests the kinds of capacity that the islands will bring for a vigorous and successful COP. And then I want to commend organizations already there on the front line, like the Caribbean Natural Resource Institute, Canary, where I sit. We are involved in putting together a climate change justice coalition. So I think we're on the road to COP26 with great ambition and great expectation, calling for more agenda, more ambition than we have had so far.
Ralph, maybe I can turn to you with the same question, especially with Vanuatu being one of the most powerful voices on climate justice for Pacific Islands. What are some of the challenges that are being faced in your region, and what do you think we need to do to address some of those challenges?
Thank you, and good night from Vanuatu, where it's after 10 p.m. Very good to be on this panel. As we know, the Pacific Island states have been on the forefront of pushing for greater action on reducing carbon emissions and dealing with the climate change challenge, simply because, you know, we are some of the most threatened nations in the world. We have some of our countries like Kiribati and Tuvalu, the low-lying atolls, which face an existential threat because they will literally disappear if the sea level rises beyond a certain point. And so that's why we have been so vocal, and we were some of the key parties in Paris who achieved that agreement. And so I think our big challenge coming into COP is that a lot of the commitments made at Paris, from our point of view, are not being honored. You know, we made some commitments to emissions reduction of certain degree by certain dates not being met. We're looking forward to seeing the pledges for greater ambition. However, also, particularly on climate finance, the amount of money that was supposed to be put on the table for countries like Vanuatu, a least developed country that's just developed or just graduated to developing country status in the last 6 months, looking to get some sort of funding from the countries that contribute to climate change. And as the ambassador said, we are not contributors, but we now face the greatest costs. For example, Vanuatu is responsible for 0.0016% of global emissions, and yet now we've been ranked by the United Nations University as the most disaster-prone country in the world for many years running. And we've had a tropical cyclone back in 2015, which is the first Category 5 cyclone in the Pacific, which cost us over a period of 2 to 3 days, 64% of our GDP, in one single event. And being a least developed country at the time, like, how are we supposed to continue to provide the development our citizens expect in a parliamentary democracy in that context without substantial assistance from the Green Climate Fund, these funds that all countries have committed to, and yet to get that, we regard it as compensation, loss and damage compensation. It's not forthcoming to the extent we expect and we need to continue to, maintain a trajectory of improving living standards for our population. So coming into COP, we're a bit disappointed by the ongoing activities of many developing countries. I mean, we're still building and opening new coal mines. We're still planning to open them in the future. Still building and opening new coal-powered power plants and planning to do so in the future. Building new oil wells, new oil pipelines, planning to do so. Resisting real climate action. And of course, continue to provide enormous subsidies to very few corporations that actually benefit from this extraction. And we have the solution at our fingertips. We know we can change now, and we need to change now. We need to absolutely stop any more carbon being extracted from the land and from the seas. But the fact that this isn't happening, and it's happening far too slow, and countries are still not committed to that goal, makes us wonder whether COP is going to be enough, whether we're going to see the commitments coming out. And when I was at the COP in Poland a couple of years ago, And, we came out, we went in expecting a lot more. And I very much hope that this one is not going to be like that, but let's see.
Thanks, Ralph. Angelique, can I maybe ask you, especially in terms of the SIDS, what, and from a young person perspective, what you see as some of those challenges that are being faced, and what your take is at this moment?
Good afternoon, everyone, and greetings from the Seychelles. So really, I'll take it very much or start off very much from a youth perspective, and I think the issue's definitely been compounded by the COVID-19 pandemic. So what we're seeing from a youth perspective is essentially a double crisis, even perhaps a triple crisis if you count unemployment. So it's a double debt crisis in the sense, well, a double crisis in the sense that, first off, climate change remains a real existential threat, especially from a young person. It almost doesn't matter in terms of which countries are low-lying. I mean, from a youth perspective, it's coming. And that continues to be a threat that is live and always of concern for young people. And it certainly doesn't help when we're being excluded from decision-making processes. So many decisions are being made today, and we know that we're going to automatically inherit them. And because many politicians think in 5-year cycles, it means that not these long-term considerations are not necessarily being taken into consideration that will affect the lives of young people as we continue to grow and develop our country. But in addition to this climate crisis, we also have a debt crisis. With COVID-19, we've seen that many countries, especially small island developing states, as our tourism industry practically collapsed. It has meant that our countries have turned to seek support with debt, which means that a lot of young people, us, will be paying for generations to come for these debts that are now being taken on. And again, it raises the concern of our young people being included in these decision-making processes and making sure that yes, debt is going to be one of the options, but how are we making sure that the use of those monies are then going towards sustainable investments and are making sure that it's not actually contributing to the detriment and aggravating climate change in the process, but is actually going to be supporting a green recovery. So from a young person's perspective, that is certainly a sort of two very key concerns. But in addition to that, I want to echo the issue of income categorization of countries. And Seychelles, we face a lot of that where we're this high income country, tourism on its knees or not, we are categorized as a high income country. And although I don't have the information at the moment, I don't know the debt that we're taking on for the recovery. I don't know at which interest that's coming in, because as a high income country, you don't tend to have access to concession refinance. You don't tend to have access to grants to support your development. And I think this is certainly something that small island developing states are being hampered by. Despite our categorization in terms of acknowledging our vulnerability and being a SIDS, we're still falling in this bracket of you're now too developed or too rich to receive support. And that in the long term continues to be a growing concern. But just to end and to say that like many other islands around the world, our region faces many similar challenges, including coastal erosion. As you know, 99% of the Seychelles is ocean. So seeing things like coral bleaching, that's clearly undermining our industries, our livelihoods, and our survival. So I'll end it there, but certainly a lot of challenges, and definitely a lot more needs to be done in order to address them. Thank you.
Thank you, Angelique. I actually maybe moving on to our next question around that, because the writer and activist Arundhati Roy said, You know, there are many threads of injustice that need to be undone in this tapestry that of the world that we exist in. And we've seen various initiatives, some that are global, that address multiple crises, such as the SDGs, UNCTAD's Global Green New Deal, some sectoral, such as the Just Transition frameworks, and of course, many that have come up from civil society around, you know, well-being, living in balance, that seek to do that. And we've heard also from the UK government that is hosting the COP presidency that its goals for the COP is coal, cars, canopy and cash, right? I wonder what your thoughts are as panel on what you think are maybe some of the most important solutions and programs that we should be amplifying, and what you think is maybe a dead end and doesn't address these multiple crises that so many face, and in particularly small island states, and what can help us deliver the reality of the climate justice and prevent the climate breakdown. Maybe I'll start with Richard first.
Thanks, Asad. Asad, good to see you, and thanks to the Commonwealth Foundation for the invitation. I mean, my fellow panelists have outlined the particular challenges that island economies face, but and I think particularly as Angelique noted, a lot of the problems are problems of many developing countries. They're in a way an exaggerated form given the scale challenges and the infrastructure weaknesses that many islands face. They become particularly intense in developing countries, but these are development challenges that are now being tasked by the impending climate crisis. And I think we all know that at the end of the day, this problem can only be solved at the global level. So much hinges on whether we have a multilateral system that is fit for purpose, to borrow a phrase. And, you know, our worry, particularly with respect to finance, particularly with respect to issues of technology transfer, is that the way in which the multilateral system has evolved over the last 40 years does not put it in a strong position to push for the kind of cooperation and coordination that is needed, and in particular to respect the notion of common but differentiated responsibilities, where the onus is quite clearly on the advanced economies whose wealth has depended critically on 200 years of carbon-led growth. And so, you know, that's our concern, as you mentioned, I said about the Global Green New Deal, comes out of that need to marry the long-standing development challenges and asymmetries that have to be overcome with the new challenges that derive from both the mitigation and the adaptation challenges linked to the climate crisis. I mean, the adaptation one, which I know is a particularly pressing one for islands, is, I think, something we need to talk about more. I mean, it's basically, I mean, the COP process has largely ignored adaptation. I mean, it's always been about mitigation. You know, there's a strong racist element to that kind of neglect, in my opinion, that I think needs to be discussed. The interesting thing about this year, I think, is that the COVID-19, plus the fact that advanced economies have been hit this year by a series of extreme weather events, has put the adaptation issue probably much more firmly on the agenda than it would have been if we hadn't seen either of those two events. And that's, I think, a positive thing. You know, from our point of view, I think the continuing neglect of the development dimension of the climate challenge, particularly amongst advanced economies, and the neoliberalization of the multilateral system, poses very profound obstacles to coming up with genuine multilateral solutions that can deliver, particularly on the financing front. I think Angelique mentioned the problem of debt, which is not only a problem for island economies, but for many developing countries. There is simply no way to handle the debt problem in the current multilateral architecture, and for, at least for us in UNCTAD, unless we do serious debt relief, debt cancellation, it will be very difficult for many developing countries, not only island economies, to mobilize the kind of resources they need for the investments to deal with both the climate and the adaptation problem. So there's real concerns, I think, from our side about the effectiveness of the current multilateral system, and we would argue, therefore, the need for linking the climate discussion to a larger discussion about reform of that system.
Ambassador Williams, we've just heard, of course, that about the importance of climate finance and finance generally in terms of ensuring that that developing countries and specifically small island states can meet this challenge of both addressing the climate crisis and adapting to the realities of the climate emergency. I wonder what your thoughts are in terms of some of the arguments about, the unmet promise of the 100 billion and of course, how we increase that scale of finance going into the COP26 summit.
Yes, going into the summit, we've got to, as SIDS, and I think this is the intention, that the SIDS are going to continue to raise the alarm and raise calls for raising the ambition. And the ambition around finance is a critical one. For example, of the $100 billion that was promised from Copenhagen on, if you look at that, some has not yet been, in almost 10 years has not been raised, but only about 20% of what's been raised goes towards adaptation. That's insufficient, and in fact, about 2% of that goes to SIDS. So we think that the emergency requires attention to the dollars and the redistribution of the dollars, as was said earlier on. We've got to decarbonize, end the subsidies for fossil fuel, take all of those resources and put it into the green recovery, as was said, as well as into adaptation-based ecosystems, support and development, particularly around the Sustainable Development Goals. So the position of the SIDS through AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island Developing States, is to call for $1 billion fund per year for financing locally led adaptation initiatives. And that is something that should be given a lot of oxygen, because it will change the dynamic in terms of reducing the impacts, whether it is in health, the issue now of mosquito-borne and other waterborne diseases that have come about, or food insecurity that countries are grappling with, or the challenges to agriculture generally, or to our clean water supply or oceans. So it is clear that the financing has not kept pace with the escalation of the climate emergency. And so whether it is a Green Climate Fund or bilateral or other multilateral support, there is need for a scaling up of resources, and that it should be widely distributed, not just with governments, but there is a willingness and there is a call, for example, in the Sustainable Development Goals, for a whole of society approach to the climate situation. And that means all the CSOs on the ground, all the private sector players, that everyone needs to get involved in not just calling for the financing, but in making it have impact on the ground where the disasters are being played out. So I think it's in that way that the marrying of actual resources, implementation action to the escalating events is really where we will start to see the application of our thinking on adaptation come to an end, get stronger.
Let me just turn to Ralph. Ralph, you've led and been a powerful advocate on the arguments about making fossil fuel companies pay compensation for the damage that they're creating. You've also been a champion, of course, about loss and damage. I was wondering what your thoughts are about, this issue about particularly climate finance and other key goals at the COP26.
Well, I think, when it comes to talking about where is the money going to come from, it's almost like a no-brainer that there's corporations, and I would say less than 100, that are generating billions of dollars of profit each year off fossil fuels. And there are solutions that have been proposed, for example, by your organization, climate damages tax. And the political will this is the time. I mean, we're past due for recognition that it's time to shift that money into the solutions that we desperately need at this point in time. And it's often very frustrating for us to watch from the margins, the continuing capture of governments by the corporations, when we all know, I mean, we saw the video at the beginning of this webinar very clearly. I mean, that it said it very clearly, we've got to stop carbon coming out of the ground, we've got to do this change. And so we all know, and especially the young people that are at the forefront, they really see it because it's much more their future that's being impacted. And there needs to be the courage to make those decisions and remove ourselves from being beholden, because that is where the money is. And that's where we can get the money from to make these changes, provide that finance. And that's why, when I was in the position to advocate, much more effectively, I was going around talking about, we've got to go to the International Court of Justice, get an advisory opinion so that we have a legal basis for starting to push for the outcomes we can't get through negotiation. When we're negotiating, when we've reached the end of the line, we see that things aren't happening. We've got to be able to take legal action, and organizations and individuals all around the world are already doing that. It just hasn't really entered this space of the multilateral forums like the UNFCCC, even the COPs. There needs to be some lines drawn in the sand and saying, okay, we're going for these outcomes, and if we can't negotiate them, we'll find other ways to get them.
Well, I'm going to come back to you because actually there are quite a number of questions on this particular issue, but I'm just going to turn to Angelique. I mean, many of the demands that are now inside the climate summit originally originated from civil society outside us, building power, supporting global South countries, particularly small island states, to put those issues on the agenda. We face a situation particularly with what I think many of us would say would be the limited outcomes that are on the table in terms of around the COP. What would you say from an activist and a youth perspective should be some of the demands that we should be making towards the COP26?
Yeah, it's interesting. I have the perspective of both the activist but also participate in negotiations. So I know the challenge of getting to consensus and text that is agreeable. So I speak perhaps with that realism when I give the point as to what I think we should be pushing for. But it definitely has to be climate finance as a top priority. It's really interesting. For the past couple of years, we've been hearing the need for more ambition in the NDCs, and since have have lived up to that. We've submitted, and most of us have submitted ambitious NDCs. Seychelles in particular, I know it well, where we've made bold, ambitious commitments linked to nature-based solutions and protecting these blue carbon ecosystems and so on. So what's interesting is that we continue to raise ambition, and of course, as small islands where we have to, I don't think we necessarily have a choice here. But then at the same time, as we continue to raise ambition, the finance is not coming in to support. Or if it's coming in, it comes with so many terms and conditions and so many TNCs and dotted lines that we need to sign on that we need to even reflect, or we act from a position of desperation rather than in a position of fairness and equity and meaningful partnership. And I think this is definitely sort of an issue of concern. But so climate finance, absolutely number one. Next, of course, is loss and damage. And here I speak very much from the youth activist perspective. There's going to be a limit to there's going to be limits to adaptation. There's going to be a time when we're no longer going to be able to adapt. And if we're not and we're already dealing with loss and damage, this is not futuristic and so on. Things are happening now. Bills are racking up right now, dealing with issues of loss and damage, yet we don't have action and support to support small island developing states and other countries on that. So now one of the things I definitely say should be a priority is the Santiago network, which is one step forward with dealing with issues of loss and damage. And finally, last point is we need the rule book completed. It needs to get done. We cannot continue to have these back and forths, no decisions. We're going back to stage one. We want to go back to the original text or our original positions. We need a completed rule book. I think and this is very much a personal opinion, I think if we don't see the ambition that we need coming out of the NDC, and if we don't see a completed rule book, I think there may be a case to go back to the drawing board. And that worries me, because it was a big momentum, a big push at Paris. Why are we regressing now? Thanks.
Thank you. So we've got a few minutes just on this, so maybe I'll come back to, in fact, get all of your opinion on two questions. There are many questions. I've just picked two out. One, building on what you were saying, Ralph, about the importance of using the law as a policy tool, particularly around loss and damage and on impacts, and taking action against fossil fuel companies. What you're thinking is about how that process works between litigation and negotiation, and how they can interact and inspire more further reaching progress, particularly on the pillar of loss and damage. And maybe, and then there's a broader question that I also would love to get your reflections on, which is, so many more. It's actually a much broader one about how we communicate this moment of multiple crises. There are some people who say, look, talking about the climate crisis is talking about just the cause and about the effects of a deeper systemic issue. And shouldn't we be focusing more on the root causes of what is causing the climate crisis, causing the crisis of inequality, rather than trying to address each of these issues in their own silos, whether it's climate, poverty and inequality, development, etc. And what your thoughts are about that in the run-up towards the COP. So let me go to Ralph first, and then I'll turn to Ambassador Williams, and then Richard, and then back to you, Angelique.
Well, just to say the Pacific was at the forefront of pushing for the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice on nuclear weapons, and that went through, right? And that's been the basis for the new convention that is now reached the required number of signatories. It's a matter of putting a question and getting it approved by the majority of the General Assembly. So 2 years ago, when I was the Foreign Minister of Vanuatu, we got a put it up to the Pacific Islands Forum, which is 20 countries in the Pacific. And it was noted for pushing forward. So it is possible with a bit of diplomatic effort. And I think there's a increasing appetite almost every month for this approach, so we can get this opinion, which can then lay the foundation for establishing, clear markers of state duties, what states have to be taking, what action they have to be taking towards finding effective and equitable solutions to climate change. There's a view that it would hinder climate negotiations, but it would help. We believe it would help climate negotiations by providing this clear legal framework within which you negotiate. And so I suppose that's how I'd respond to the initial question that you put about, how realistic is it? And I think it's a fundamental issue that we need to, for a country like Vanuatu, when you talk about climate justice, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about establishing obligations created by your actions. Because you did this, you therefore you're obligated to provide some recompense because people have been affected by your actions. And it's a basic sort of almost like a tort kind of situation.
Thank you, Ralph. Richard.
Yeah, so thanks. Look, you cannot talk about climate finance unless you talk about the fundamental changes in the way in which finance has operated over the last four decades and its overall impact on the economy. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, we are now in highly financialized economies. Not only the economic power and influence of large financial actors has grown exponentially, but their political influence has also grown in that context significantly. And they've been one of the great ironies for us of their rise, because they've sold their rise as being good for investment. That is, the more innovativeness and capacity financial markets have gained, the better for the investment climate. That's the kind of story that's sold. The great irony is that if you look at the data, as financialization has taken hold, investment in the productive economy has declined. Now, given that the climate adaptation and mitigation challenges involve huge amounts of investment, we have a clear disconnect between the mobilization of resources to invest productively and the challenges around the climate agenda that requires more productive investment in mitigation and adaptation. And I think you have to be realistic about linking the climate challenge to the need to contest the influence of unregulated finance and to think of ways both of re-regulating finance and different types of financial instruments, particularly public banks, as a source of financing productive investment if you're going to meet the kinds of investment challenges we're talking about, both in island economies and beyond that. And linked to that, just to finish, Asan, they have been very influential in influencing the discussion. All the debate about ESG and BlackRock somehow persuading G20 finance ministers that they have the capacity to be able to fund a just transition is a huge distortion. That this guy who was the chief investment officer for BlackRock, Tariq Fancy, has written very clearly about the distortion that large finance has had on the understanding of the way in which modern finance works and its detrimental impact on raising financial resources for the kind of investment that we need to address the climate challenge. And unless we kind of get into the nitty-gritty of that world, I think simply pleading for more finance is not going to work, because their influence and power is simply too great at this moment in time, unfortunately.
Thank you, Richard. Ambassador Williams, one might be better if you turn off your video. That might help on bandwidth. So why don't you do that, and we'll see if the audio works. And whilst you're doing that, let's ask. I'll pop over to Angelique.
So I'll keep it short. It's just 2 points. So, should we address sort of the how do we communicate the multiple crises? It has to be structural. We have to be going to the root cause. I don't see any other way to do it. And we know now with COVID-19 that governments, industry are able to take sweeping decisions rapidly to make change. What moves them is something we need to think about, but we know that it can happen. And the second point for me about sort of the justice component of it, I think it very much links to an issue of human rights as well. I think it's absolutely tragic. I think Richard was saying it, like now more natural disasters are happening in these advanced economies, so they're understanding. I think it's absolutely tragic that we have to wait for these disasters to come home for us to get it. So this is an issue of human rights, and all humans being equal wherever you live. And as such, I certainly think that that's the approach that needs to be taken in terms of thinking about solutions as well. Thanks.
We know that facing all of these multiple crises, the importance of solidarity, both between people and of course, South-South, and then between the global North and the global South. And I've always been struck, for me, as I come originally from a country of the Commonwealth, Pakistan, and the Commonwealth was an important actor, particularly in the fight against apartheid, where I thought it demonstrated solidarity in a real meaningful way in driving the global conversation and delivering the actions that were needed. I'm wondering what your reflections are about, what the Commonwealth could be doing in this moment and how it could be maybe doing more to lead up to and during COP26 to deliver the demands around climate justice. Ralph, over to you first.
Thank you. That's an interesting question because generally the like-mindedness is among, for example, the groups we are more familiar working with are, SIDS, IOSIS, LDCs. When you get to the Commonwealth, you have a range from, the IOSIS, SIDS countries right up to the highly developed economies. And sometimes the actions on climate are quite different. And so I think it's important for the Commonwealth, if it is to have a collective approach, to do a lot more, I would say, negotiation within, to try and see if we can come up to some common positions that we can take forward into COP and other climate negotiations. Because there are some, in the Pacific, for example, we have the Pacific Islands Forum, and we have a very clear case of discordant relations with one of our members, which is Australia, on the issue of climate change. And of course, Australia is a member of the Commonwealth as well. So we haven't been able to really resolve it within the forum. I don't think we'll be able to resolve it within the Commonwealth because there are such different approaches on the issue of climate change. So there needs to be more work done to talk among ourselves to see if we can, and the good thing is we have countries now like the UK, which is taking a lot more progressive approach, who can then perhaps help us to talk to other countries to get us all on, at least in the same sort of parameters of discussion. I think that's all I'll say without being undiplomatic.
I definitely don't want you to be undiplomatic, Ralph. So maybe over to you, Angelique. One of the challenges that Ralph talks about, of course, existed and have always existed in the Commonwealth between rich developed countries and, of course, countries of the global South. And we're even at play during the anti-apartheid struggle. But we changed that dynamic, partly from the movements of people on the outside. Are there opportunities for us to do the same as citizens in the Commonwealth?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the Commonwealth can definitely continue to be a convener, at the table, different countries, but it has so many similarities, having these difficult conversations. I think that's definitely something that can continue to remain. And given that its membership has a lot, I think it's the majority, yes, I'm sure it is the majority of their membership are small island developing states. There should continue to be advocacy by the Commonwealth for SIDS in particular. But one of the things that I'd like to also emphasize on is some of the most successful initiatives within the climate space is ones that go beyond the typical regional blocks. So it's when we're able to move away of just, the African group, AOSIS, LDCs, and so on, and a group of us, of like-minded individuals coming together and pushing a certain agenda. And we saw this with the ocean resolution that came about at COP25. So I think the Commonwealth can certainly act as a platform to assist us in making that happen. I agree with Ralph, there are challenges. I wouldn't say that there aren't, but at the same time, I think it's spot on that citizens need to play a greater role in putting pressure nationally within the countries, but also as civil society once we get to the negotiations, making sure voices are heard, making sure that the negotiator, when they go into the room, they're not thinking about whether that should be a comma or a full stop. They're thinking about the voice of that person who they've just spoken to and really thinking about justice.
Thank you. Richard, as somebody who obviously operates in the UN and is in different multilateral spaces with lots of different configurations of groups, I wonder what your view is as the Commonwealth as a space that brings these multi-stakeholders together of countries between developed and developing countries to be able to put this agenda, and maybe also what you think about whether there's a conflict between the Commonwealth's views on economic development and climate change.
I'm not sure if I'm in a position to answer the last of those questions, Asa. I mean, obviously we face the same problems as the Commonwealth Institute as a universal, we have our attempt is to build a consensus amongst developing countries first and foremost, but then in dialogue with developed countries. That's what UNCTAD was set up to do. And in a way, the high point of that discussion was the new international economic order. So if we're talking now about a new international greener economic order, which I think is what we are doing, it's what our global Green New Deal in a sense is trying to do, we have to be honest that unlike the 70s, the solidarity question, which you raised earlier, it's just less pronounced. The degree of solidarity within the developing world is far less pronounced than it was in the 1970s. I think that's an important thing to recognize, and it poses all kinds of problems for us in the work that we do. And I think it has, it raises challenges for the marriage of the climate and the development challenges, which is, I think, what we're talking about. That said, one of the features of the last decade that is in COD, more than that really, is the re-emergence of South-South cooperation as part of the international narrative. And it's not on the level that we would like to see, but it's throwing out innovative and potentially significant developments that need to be built on in the climate, and that includes financing issues. We've seen a number of new financial institutions emerge out of South cooperation, not on the scale that's needed, but posing a challenge to traditional multilateral financial institutions, and that's a good thing. We've seen a greater willingness to share policy lessons and experiences within developing countries. To take an example, which I think speaks directly to the climate issue, you cannot do a just transition of the kind that we're talking about without serious industrial policy. For the last 40 years, the neoliberal tradition has removed industrial policy from the policy toolkit available to developing countries. It's back on the agenda, and the only people that can meaningfully talk about that right now are countries in the South that never gave up on it. So, and the sharing of those experiences, I think, is taking place. I think that's a valuable addition to the policy discussion we're talking. So I mean, I think we face, I think, the same problems as the Commonwealth about an intransigent attitude from the advanced economies who remain wedded in most cases to a neoliberal agenda, unfortunately. but also to the divisions within the South that will have to be overcome if developing countries are able to force through a more inclusive agenda that embraces the development aspects of the climate challenge in a meaningful way. It's politics is a messy business, as you know, Asad, and it's a particularly messy business at the international level. And unless we sort that out fairly urgently, it's very easy to be pessimistic about the prospects of the kinds of systemic changes that we all know are what is required to address the kind of challenges we're talking about.
I wonder, well, just on this, part of the question about the transformation is also tied to the question about democracy, right? And we're seeing, of course, at the very moment we need more multilateralism, more solidarity, the very pillars of democratic institutions and democracy are under threat in so many different places around the world. And I suppose there's a question from a colleague, Shubnam Gupta in India, was talking about can the challenges of redefining democracy in developing countries to make sure that environmental decisions taken at a global level are actually implemented domestically as well. And I just wonder what your reflections are on these challenges of democracy and the weakening of our democratic institutions at this very moment that they're most needed.
Well, I mean, I'm a politician myself, and one of my main policy imperatives is to reform our political system in my country, because it's a colonial inheritance, and it doesn't really suit getting society's views represented and implemented in policy, which include, I think, these issues from the international level, because there is great popular support for issues of climate change, adaptation, the need to transform our economies to improve livelihoods in a sustainable, ecologically sustainable way, in a better way. But our political institutions are not representing that, and are not fit for that purpose. And so for myself, in my own country, as a politician, that is one of my main imperatives, is to try and reform that system by amending our constitution, putting in new laws regulating political activity, so that we start to reduce the space for politicians and open up more space for civil society as political actors. So more representation that doesn't necessarily come out of the ballot box, and make the ballot box representation a much more accurate representation. So I'm only speaking on that from my own country, my own experience, and I know that we are, we're lucky to be in a far better situation than many countries when it comes to implementing democracy. But I do think it is across the board challenge, especially for Commonwealth countries that have inherited the UK system in a lot of ways, that we need to make it homegrown and suited to our purpose. And that will continue to be one of my main objectives in politics.
Thank you. Maybe Angelique, I'd love to hear your perspective. I mean, we in the climate justice movements have always long said, we have the policies, we know the actions that are needed. Our politicians lack the political will to act. They act in the interest of powerful vested interests rather than people, citizens, and our planet. And of course that is a challenge about democracy, and more than just simply voting. I wonder what your view, especially when you're trying to build this power from the bottom up, about the importance of the fight around democracy and the climate crisis.
Yeah. It's a really important one. And it does, as they're very much interrelated. And I think one of the things that we often forget is the power of the citizen, right? And especially for young people, sort of the power of the vote as well. I know one of the initiatives that we're always sharing in the Seychelles is about how the issue of a plastic bag ban became a political issue. It was a campaign. It was a campaign being run by young people, and we made it a political issue to the point where, because it was run so close to elections, you know, campaign promises were being made about the ban during political broadcasts, right? So I think it is important that we never underestimate the power of the vote, the power of the citizen, and then beyond the vote, right? It's not only about election day. Obviously, it's keeping people to account afterwards as well. But then there's one thing that I always ask this to sort of to the crowd, you know, do you make your voting decision based on the climate decisions that your government takes? And I very rarely get a full house of hands go up that says, I vote on this issue. Oftentimes we're moved by other things. And as such, you know, in terms of the reasoning or the factors for the decisions that you make, climate isn't as high as other things. So I think it's certainly something that needs to continue to make sure that people realize the connectivity of climate with all other aspects of life, so that we're using our decision both in the ballot box, but then subsequently when we're keeping our leaders to account. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm wondering whether I could maybe ask the panel just for your final thoughts. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, Richard, but we did have a question asking if you could maybe explain what the Global Green New Deal actually is. But so maybe some concluding remarks, but also what you think maybe is the call to action as we head into the COP26. So I will go Richard first, then Ralph, and then you, Angelique.
Yeah, thanks, Asad. Look, just following on from the last question, you know, one of the things that I think worries me about, you know, moving ahead on these difficult questions is the lack of trust that people have in their, not just political representatives, but in the states that hold their societies together. And at the end of the day, unfortunately, the state is the solution to this problem. But it's not, it's also a potential problem in itself, given what Ralph and others have said about the capture of states by narrow interest groups. And that's, I think the heart of the challenge is, can we rebuild states that engage with citizenry, that build the levels of trust that are required for the kind of collective and large-scale action that we're talking about, but also have the tools at their disposal to be able to actually come through on the promises that they make to the citizens. And in a way, I think the Global Green New Deal is an attempt to kind of provide a different international space to allow states to rebuild their relationship with the many rather than the few, to borrow a term, and to have the resources available to them to actually deliver on the kinds of promises that those citizens expect, not only with respect to climate, but with respect to a broad set of development challenges. So it's a different set of principles, it's a different set of institutions that we think need to be in place at the multilateral level to be able to give the local level, both the national and the subnational levels, that kind of freedom to be able to live up to the expectation of its citizens. I think that's in a way what we want to see. It's what the old New Deal tried to do in the United States. We can argue about whether it succeeded or not, but it was the inspiration for the old New Deal. And I think it needs to be the inspiration for the Global Green New Deal today.
Thank you, Richard. Ralph, before I come to you, I think we might have sorted out Ambassador Williams' audio, so let me give her the floor.
Can you hear me?
Oh, perfect. Yes.
Oh, so we'll have to do this whole panel again next week. How's that?
Indeed. Well, I'll give you a little bit more leeway. Go on.
Yes, thank you. Gee, I'm not sure where we really are because I missed a bit there. But I think we're coming towards our closing.
Yeah, I was asking all of the panel just to give their closing remarks and what they, and maybe one call for action in the run up towards the COP26.
Oh, well, one call for action is to support the agenda of the SIDS. You can't go wrong with that. We have put together through AOSIS a very ambitious and vigorous program in relation to the multiple challenges now on finance, on mitigation, on adaptation, on loss and damage, and all of that. And I think that it is really important to familiarize ourselves, and the Commonwealth should be the champion for SIDS. So that's one. Secondly, I think the campaign, which has gone global for 1.5 to stay alive, should be embraced by all in the Commonwealth. We are the majority of members, the SIDS are, but I think everybody has islands, including the UK. They're not as threatened as we are, but I think the 1.5 to stay alive, which is an interesting coalition and campaign from civil society to some of the government. Thirdly, I think the focus on the circular economy, on refining.
I think we're back to having some challenges with your audio, Ambassador Williams. It's really unfortunate. Let's see if we can try and sort that out again. Over to you, Ralph.
Well, I just want to echo exactly what Ambassador Williams said, that the Commonwealth needs to take its message from IOSIS and the SIDS, and that needs to be the Commonwealth message. I mean, that is the way the Commonwealth can be an effective agent in the COP, the upcoming COP, because the message from IOSIS and the SIDS is the most urgent message we're hearing, and that's the message that has formulated the 1.5 target in Paris, and it will continue to set the most ambitious agenda we can have for, well, that is needed to deal with the climate crisis. So we very much hope that that's something that the Commonwealth will take upon itself, the other countries, to make sure that that message is the one taken forward into the negotiations. When it comes back to the political issue, the question that Richard asked, it is very difficult, and it's really a question that has to be faced, because I agree with him. States are the ultimate agent of the self-determination of nations, and it's unfortunate the form governments have taken, and we citizens in our respective countries need to work on improving the state as a representation of the will of the people, to make them more effective agents for doing the changes that people would like to see and people want to see and the world needs, and more effective international cooperation. So I think that's all I'll say on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to you, Angelique. And maybe I can add one small thing, like, what would be your one call on the Commonwealth in the run up towards the COP as well?
Okay, so my call to action is don't lose sight of what this is really about. Let's not just focus on thinking about going to this conference. Yes, we're at the conference, but don't lose sight of what it's really about. And my one call to the Commonwealth is, I think it's already been said, sort of carrying the voice of SIDS and from AOSIS, but I'd also say the people of SIDS and AOSIS member states, making sure that their voices are really being carried by both the states, but also the Commonwealth. So let's not just think about it sort of government to government, but also the civil society organizations in these countries and the people. Thank you.
We are coming to the end of this session. So we've got a few minutes left. I don't know, Ambassador Williams, whether your audio was sorted and you wanted to come back in.
Well, can you hear me again?
I can hear you again.
Thank you. Yes, we've got to fix this, huh?
Yes.
And I think I was saying that the support for the SIDS from the Commonwealth can be at the global level in the negotiations, but as has just been said by Angelique, beyond that, at a much wider level, decarbonize your own economies, the developed members of the Commonwealth, and use that resources to transfer to bring about the green solutions in your own society as models and in our society as partners. So there's room for stronger Commonwealth collaboration, North-South and South-South. And as Richard has been emphasizing, the challenge of transitioning the global structural arrangements can be undertaken by Commonwealth countries, whether in G7, G20, at the UN Security Council, at the World Bank, at the new financing agencies, that to bring in a greater modicum of inclusiveness and democracy would really make a difference to the ability of the SIDS to finance our own development. So it's a broad fabric out there, and be assured that the islands are doing their part. And lastly, I would say, before, during, and after the COP, we're facing the hurricane season in all the islands, certainly here in the Caribbean. And it would be important for solidarity in all its forms from the Commonwealth to be extended to the regions of the world in the hurricane season, whether it's early warning systems, it's support for loss and damage, it's training for women and rural people for their skills and their livelihood. There is a wide range of Commonwealth solidarity that can be undertaken. And I thank you all, and I think I'll just close now.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all the amazing panel. I think absolutely the importance of focusing on the structural issues, the importance of intersectionality, of connecting these multiple crises, and the importance of going towards the COP with a clear set of demands that are rooted in the realities of climate, of the climate emergency, and ensure that we deliver justice. We all know the change is coming. The only question is, what kind of change will it be? Who will pay the price? And if this transition will be just and fair, and will it deliver the safe world that we all aspire and fight for? That, of course, is not going to just be in the hands of government leaders. It's up to each and every one of us. And we all know that we are the ones that can change the dial on this conversation, amplify the demands, and build our collective power. And I would say that this has got to be our message. When change has ever happened in this world, whether it's at a local level, at a national, and a global level, it's only happened because we as citizens have built our collective power. We've united with progressive voices and politicians, and we delivered the kind of policies and demands to make our governments act. The window is closing on 1.5. To keep it alive, to deliver the kind of world that we want, we have to use these next 50 days to make sure that this climate summit doesn't just take place behind curtains without much public attention. We have to build our power on the streets here in the UK. And on November 6th, there is a global day of action for climate justice, amplifying those voices and demands of developing countries, particularly small island states and least developed countries, about the demands that they needed. It's our responsibility and our job, all of us, to tackle this climate crisis. I want to thank all of our amazing panelists, Angelique, Ralph, Ambassador Williams, Richard, I want to also thank the incredible staff from the Commonwealth Institute, Gillian, Joni, Rowena, Medea, Leo, Max, Angeli, Ulash, Anthony. Apologies if I forgot anybody who made this event possible, did all of the hard work to bring us together. They have an amazing set of events. If you've not taken part in one before, in November, they're actually very fitting to the conversation we've just had. I'm going to have a series of mini conversations about addressing the future questions of Commonwealth reform, and it's going to be a mini part of a 3-part series. That's posted in the chat. If you haven't seen it in the chat, go to the Commonwealth Institute for more information. Do sign up so you'll get more information of all the notice. We are literally at a minute. Commonwealth Foundation. I keep saying Commonwealth Institute. I'm so sorry. I've got Commonwealth Institute in my head. Commonwealth Foundation. Please go to the Commonwealth Foundation, to the website. I want to thank all of you for making this time. This is a moment where we have to bend the arc of injustice towards an arc of justice. We have to create the world that we want. Thank you ever again. Thank you, everybody. And goodbye to you all from wherever you are in the world. And I'm so sorry if we didn't get to all of your questions.